For years, the whispers echoed through the palace halls, grumblings of favor, manipulation, and power grabs. But no one expected King Charles to finally break the royal silence with one sweeping decision that would send shockwaves across the monarchy. It began with a statement brief, carefully worded, but undeniably seismic. The official release from Buckingham Palace, marked with the royal seal, spoke of a necessary restructuring of royal trusts in the interest of long-term institutional integrity. The announcement was clinical in tone, almost sterile. But it didn't take long for royal observers, insiders, and the public to notice what wasn't said rather than what was. Nowhere in the statement was there mention of Camilla's family. No Laura Lopes, no Tom Parker Bowles, no subtle phrasing that might imply their continued inclusion. For those who had been watching the dynamics unfold over the years, the message was unmistakable. Camilla's family had been quietly and deliberately removed from every royal trust. Within hours, speculations surged across social media and global tabloids. Some wondered if this was a prelude to a larger royal reform. Others suspected retaliation. Perhaps a long-buried fracture had finally surfaced. The fact that this move came amid a wave of public scrutiny couldn't be ignored. Polls had shown a steep decline in support for Camilla's family being affiliated with royal affairs. Critics long felt they were unelected, unentitled benefactors of privilege. With pressure mounting and approval ratings in freefall, many suspected this wasn't just a strategic move, it was a survival mechanism. But the roots of this dramatic decision stretched back further than most realized. For years, there had been quiet discontent behind palace walls. Prince William, in particular, had grown increasingly uneasy with how visible and involved Camilla's children had become in royal functions. The presence of Laura Lopes at high-profile events, often escorted by senior aides, raised eyebrows not just among the public, but within the royal inner circle. Her proximity to influence stirred quiet comparisons to those born into the Windsor line, an implication that didn't sit well with the heirs of Diana. Even among royal aides, the shock was palpable. Many believed Camilla had successfully embedded her family into the fabric of royal life, securing a future legacy through proximity, if not blood. Some staff had even prepared for future announcements, formalizing Laura and Tom's roles in various charitable foundations and ceremonial events. The announcement changed everything. What was once assumed inevitable had been undone in a single stroke. But outside the palace gates, the reaction was something else entirely. As the news spread, an unexpected roar of public approval rose. Comments flooded in from across the Commonwealth, praising Charles for finally acting. "It's about time someone cleaned the house," read one message. "Diana would be proud," declared another. Hashtags like Royal Reset and For Diana surged to the top of trending charts. The monarchy, it seemed, had made a move that aligned for once with public sentiment. Yet, behind the cold, calculated announcement was a storm years in the making, one that began quietly, but grew into a secret royal war. Camilla's rise to queen was never just about love, it was about the dynasty. And when she stepped into the palace, she didn't come alone. From the very beginning, whispers followed Camilla's every move. Not just about her place beside King Charles, but about the two shadows she brought into the royal orbit, Laura Lopes and Tom Parker Bowles. While the world debated whether the public would ever accept Camilla as queen consort, she was quietly doing something far more audacious, positioning her children inside the crown's orbit. Unlike previous consorts, who kept their families separate from the royal machine, Camilla took a different route. Her children were present, not formally, not ceremonially, but they were always nearby at events, at state dinners, at celebrations that had, until then, been reserved for those born of Windsor blood. Laura, poised and quiet, was often seen near the sidelines, never quite in the spotlight, but never absent. Tom, the food critic and columnist, was less visible but enjoyed insider access few outside the crown had ever tasted. Invitations extended to them were framed as polite gestures. But to those inside, it was clear. This was no accident. This was quite an inclusion by design. Camilla was weaving her lineage into royal life, not by law, but by presence. And over time, that presence began to feel permanent. But not everyone was at ease. Behind closed doors, William and Catherine reportedly voiced their discomfort. Sources close to the palace say William felt increasingly boxed out of decisions involving the family's future, especially as Camilla's children were treated with growing reverence. The crown had always been built on bloodline and sacrifice, not association and inheritance by proxy. To William, this wasn't just a family dynamic. It was a threat to the sacred institution he was destined to inherit. Queen Elizabeth II, ever the silent observer of her legacy, was said to have held private reservations. Her public acceptance of Camilla was carefully choreographed. But privately, she was uneasy with how rapidly Camilla's family moved within royal circles. In a family where even cousins of royal blood were kept at arm's length from power, the idea of non-royals appearing in privileged positions sparked quiet concern. Inside the palace, staff who had served for decades felt a shift. The old code of royal proximity earned through lineage or lifelong service was fading. In its place was a new, unsettling reality. Camilla's family, without titles or traditional vetting, acted with a sense of belonging that hadn't been granted but assumed. One aide, anonymously quoted, called it entitlement wrapped in courtesy. Another noted that Laura often behaved like a duchess without ever being one. This silent tension created an invisible line, one that separated the heirs of Queen Elizabeth and Diana from the unofficial entourage of Camilla. And as that line blurred, so too did the boundaries of royal identity. Was the monarchy evolving, or was it being quietly restructured from within? As the invisible line between royal and outsider blurred, one heir refused to stay silent. He was raised to respect the institution but not to surrender it. When Prince William saw what was happening behind the scenes, he decided it was time to defend his mother's legacy at all costs. For years, William held his tongue. Bound by duty, shaped by restraint, he watched as Camilla's family crept closer to the throne, not through blood, not through sacrifice, but through subtle infiltration. What began as quiet tolerance soon twisted into something deeply unsettling. Royal events once reserved for heirs and senior figures now saw the presence of Laura Lopes and Tom Parker Bowles, seated just a breath away from power. What seemed like hospitality on the surface felt, to William, like encroachment beneath it. And for a man still haunted by the memory of his mother, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. He had already accepted Camilla as queen, but her family being folded into the monarchy's inner workings? That was a line too far. Behind palace walls, friction escalated. William and Charles, once allies in rebuilding the monarchy's image, found themselves divided by something far more personal than politics. In private, William reportedly confronted his father with brutal honesty. "This isn't what she wanted," he said. And in that single sentence, everything shifted. The ghost of Princess Diana loomed large. Her legacy, her vision of the monarchy, was being reshaped in ways that felt like betrayal. Charles, caught between a wife he loved and a son determined to protect the crown, began to feel the weight of an institution cracking from within. The staff, once united in protocol, now whispered in factions. Long-serving aides who had pledged loyalty to Queen Elizabeth and Diana aligned quietly behind William. Others, newer and more loyal to Charles and Camilla, urged modernization. The divide wasn't just generational, it was moral. Was the monarchy a legacy to preserve or a structure to evolve? In those hushed corridors, it became clear, this wasn't just a family disagreement, it was a battle over the monarchy's soul. Outside, the public sensed the shift. Observers noticed William's increasing absence at events attended by Camilla's family. The optics were subtle but powerful. Where William once stood beside his stepmother, he now kept a measured distance. Commentators speculated. Headlines questioned whether something had fractured. And then came the moment that pushed everything over the edge. Laura Lopes, Camilla's daughter, was spotted visiting royal properties tied to the Duchy of Cornwall properties, historically managed by the heir to the throne. For some, it seemed harmless. For William, it was a breach. These weren't just estates. They were sacred symbols of the monarchy's inheritance and responsibility. And now, Camilla's daughter was walking them with the confidence of a future custodian. That single image sparked fury behind palace gates. William, already at the breaking point, took decisive action, beginning the process of freezing access, re-evaluating roles, and preparing to formally challenge the quiet absorption of Camilla's family into the royal infrastructure. But William wasn't the only one unsettled. Princess Anne was watching everything. and she had her own breaking point. The one royal who never plays politics suddenly took a side. Princess Anne had tolerated Camilla's reign, but when the family overstepped, she made her feelings known in a way that no one could ignore. For decades, Princess Anne had been the monarchy's iron spine, unwavering, duty-bound, and apolitical to the core. She kept her head down, did the work, and avoided the media storms that engulfed others. But Anne was no passive observer. She saw everything. And when the quiet currents within the palace began shifting, when Camilla's children started appearing with a little too much ease, Anne's instincts told her something dangerous was unfolding. At first, she stayed silent, biting her tongue out of respect for the institution. But when William came to her, frustrated, angry, and disillusioned, Anne listened. And that changed everything. Their conversations were private, but those close to the palace described a palpable shift afterward. Anne, once neutral, began declining invitations that involved Camilla's children. She avoided joint appearances, politely citing scheduling conflicts. But insiders knew the truth. Anne would not share royal duties with individuals who had never earned them. For her, this wasn't about ego. It was about bloodline, legacy, and the unspoken code that had kept the monarchy intact through war, scandal, and upheaval. Camilla's children, no matter how polished or polite, had crossed an invisible boundary, and Anne had had enough. Behind closed doors, Anne took the extraordinary step of confronting her brother. In a private meeting known only to a few senior advisors, she spoke with the force of a woman whose life had been built around preserving the crown. "You are the king," she reportedly said, "but you are also your mother's son." And she would never have allowed this. Her words were said to be sharp, but not cruel, delivered not as a sibling, but as a custodian of history. Charles, caught between love and legacy, listened in silence. For the first time in his reign, he was being forced to choose between two worlds that could no longer coexist. Anne didn't stop there. Those close to the situation revealed she made her position crystal clear. "Remove them now, or history will remember," she warned, leaving no ambiguity. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. She would not stand by and watch the monarchy become a playground for personal loyalty. Her allegiance was to the institution, not the individuals orbiting it. The media caught wind of her stance, and headlines exploded with speculation. "The princess takes a stand," one paper blared. Royal watchers praised Anne for her resolve, with many seeing her as the last remaining symbol of Queen Elizabeth's era, disciplined, restrained, incorruptible. The public sentiment tilted again, and the pressure on Charles became unbearable. The tide wasn't just turning, it was crashing. The walls were closing in, and as pressure mounted, King Charles had to choose between his wife's family and the monarchy. She wasn't just a queen, she was a mother. And as rumors swirled of royal exclusion, Camilla confronted the king not as a monarch, but as a terrified parent. In the hushed stillness of Buckingham's inner chambers, Camilla made her final appeal. No press, no advisors, just her and Charles, husband and wife. But for Camilla, this was more than marriage. It was about blood, about protecting her children, who now stood at the edge of a royal cliff, watching everything they had been allowed to touch slip away. Reports from palace insiders reveal that she didn't approach the king with anger, but with fear. A fear that the life she had built, the balance she had tried to maintain between monarchy and motherhood, was now unraveling before her eyes. Camilla's words were said to be quiet, but filled with desperation. She insisted that Laura and Tom had never asked for anything, that they had only ever stood beside her, supported her, and respected the institution. They never wanted titles, she reportedly told Charles. They never wanted power. They only wanted to belong. But beneath that plea was a deeper, more fragile truth. Camilla wasn't fighting for her children's ambitions, she was fighting to keep them from being erased. Once again, the stigma of being the second wife reared its head. And this time, it wasn't just about public judgment, it was about legacy, and the terrifying idea that history would remember her family as unworthy, excluded, irrelevant. Palace sources claim she broke down while saying, "This decision, it could tear us apart." Those words cut through Charles like glass. Because while the king had weathered scandal, criticism, and loss, this was a crisis not of policy, but of the heart. He was deeply shaken. No one could deny that. But even in that moment of raw emotion, Charles also understood the stakes. The public was no longer whispering, they were roaring. And what began as discontent had now erupted into a full-blown demand for change. The monarchy was being watched like never before, and in the court of public opinion, the inclusion of Camilla's family was fast becoming a symbol of royal indulgence, not modernization. For a brief moment, everything paused. The inner circle reportedly urged Charles to delay any formal decisions. There were talks of mediation, of redefining roles instead of removing them. Behind palace doors, tension hung like a sword over every conversation. Would the king stand by his wife or uphold the vision now championed by his son and sister? But just as the palace tried to contain the emotional firestorm, the unthinkable happened. A betrayal from within. One leak, one document, and a revelation that would shift the balance completely. And then an internal leak happened that would turn the tide completely against Camilla's family. It wasn't just bad optics. A leaked royal trust proposal bearing Camilla's silent approval revealed something far more calculated. The moment the documents surfaced, everything changed. What had once been whispered as speculation suddenly became undeniable. A confidential royal draft, originally buried deep within the Duchy of Cornwall's planning archives, found its way into the hands of someone willing to share it with the press. It detailed future oversight of several royal estates, most notably properties tied to Cornwall's historic wealth, and astonishingly, it positioned Laura Lopes as a future trustee, not as a consultant, not as a guest advisor, but as a named steward of the Crown's real estate legacy. For many, it was the smoking gun. For others, it was the betrayal they had long suspected but never proven. The uproar didn't end there. Shortly after the draft's exposure, internal emails began to circulate leaked correspondence between Camilla's private office and members of the Trust's advisory panel. The language was discreet, even diplomatic, but the pattern was unmistakable. Camilla had quietly pushed for increased visibility and influence for her children within the monarchy's financial core. She never demanded titles or recognition, but she consistently positioned them near power, near assets, near decisions that shaped the royal institution itself. What the public saw as loyalty, insiders now saw as calculated placement. Charles, when confronted with the documents, was reportedly stunned. He had always believed Camilla would maintain a boundary between her personal world and the monarchy's infrastructure. But the leak revealed how deeply those lines had blurred. For the king, it was more than just political fallout, it was a personal reckoning. Had he underestimated the ambition of those closest to him? Or had he chosen willful blindness in the name of peace? William and Anne moved swiftly. They brought the documents directly into Charles's office, placing them, some say, dramatically before him with one unified message. This had to end. No more waiting. No more negotiating. The monarchy, they insisted, could not afford this breach of trust. The royal family had withstood wars, scandals, and abdications, but what it could not survive was public belief that the crown had become a playground for unelected, untitled insiders. Camilla's silence on the matter spoke volumes. And the silence, now deafening, was seen as complicity. As the news broke, the internet exploded. The hashtag #NotOurRoyals trended across the Commonwealth. Commentators across television, print, and social media condemned the monarchy's perceived nepotism. This is not modernization, one article read. It's manipulation. Some called for reforms, others demanded resignations. And for the first time in his reign, King Charles faced the terrifying prospect of losing the very public that had so hesitantly embraced him after Elizabeth's passing. Royal advisors gathered in emergency sessions. Polls were pulled. Statements were drafted and withdrawn. But the conclusion was inescapable. If Charles did nothing, the monarchy would be seen as compromised. If he acted, it meant severing a bond not only with Camilla's children, but perhaps with Camilla herself. The weight of history bore down, pressing against the king's every breath. With the monarchy hanging in the balance, King Charles had no choice but to act, and when he did, the earth beneath Buckingham shook. On a day the palace will never forget, King Charles signed the decree that would forever redraw the lines of who belongs and who never did. It came without warning. Early that morning, a crisp statement was issued from Buckingham Palace. Short, unapologetic, final. It confirmed what had already been whispered in hushed tones across royal circles. Camilla's family had been formally and permanently removed from all royal trusts. Their roles, however, unofficial, were over. No more access, no more influence, no more shadow proximity to the heart of the monarchy's wealth and authority. From that moment forward, the management of royal properties, financial oversight, and trust participation would be handled exclusively by direct heirs of the House of Windsor. The message was unmistakable. The line had been drawn, and the gate had been shut. What the public didn't see, however, was the storm that raged behind palace walls the night before. A private family meeting was convened in a small room, far from the flash of cameras or prying staff. There, Charles sat with Camilla and delivered the blow not as a press release, but as a personal confession. He reportedly held the signed decree in his hands, his voice trembling as he explained why it had to be done. "The monarchy must survive us both," he said. And though he spoke of duty, of preserving legacy, his eyes betrayed a deeper truth. He was breaking the heart of the woman who had stood beside him through decades of scandal, isolation, and rebirth. Camilla didn't speak. Not at first. Her expression, those present said, was unreadable. And then, without a word, she stood and walked out. No plea, no protest, just silence. A silence so heavy that even seasoned courtiers felt the air shift. The queen consort, once at the height of influence, had become a ghost in her own palace. Shattered not by betrayal, but by the realization that in the end, she and her family would always be seen as outsiders. In the days that followed, Laura Lopes and Tom Parker Bowles issued no official statements, but their actions spoke volumes. Laura canceled appearances. Tom made a cryptic reference to loyalty being conditional during a podcast interview, and while they refrained from attacking the monarchy directly, their dignified distance revealed a family bruised, but not bowed. They had been erased from the royal future, but they would not be silent about the cost. Outside the gates of Buckingham, the reaction was thunderous. Crowds gathered with signs bearing slogans like "Protect the Crown" and "For William and Anne." Cheers echoed through the streets. In an era of skepticism and division, the monarchy had made a move that united the public, at least momentarily. Commentators hailed it as a necessary course correction. For some, it was Charles's finest act as king. For others, it was an overdue reckoning. But for Camilla, it was devastation. But while the public celebrated, a deep silence filled the queen consort's chambers because what came next was something she never imagined. She still wore the crown, but behind closed doors, Camilla was no longer surrounded by the people she trusted most. Her palace had become her prison. In the aftermath of Charles's decree, something inside the queen consort began to unravel. Not with rage, not even with resistance, but with an eerie stillness that blanketed her presence like a fog. She stopped attending briefings. Her schedule, once filled with engagements and receptions, was quietly emptied. Laura and Tom, once familiar fixtures near her side, had vanished from royal corridors entirely. What had once been a circle of influence was now a void, and Camilla stood alone at the center of it. The woman who had once carefully climbed her way to the crown now found herself on an island within her own castle, where loyalty had become a memory and routine had turned into quiet exile. Royal aides began to whisper about the shift. They described a different energy around her, haunted, withdrawn, no longer sharp in tone or presence. One long-serving staff member noted that the queen barely made eye contact anymore, often retreating early from functions or disappearing between corridors no one was permitted to follow. At meals, where once her laughter filled the halls, silence reigned. Even Charles, though still by her side in title, seemed to drift further with each passing day. The two were rarely seen together in public, and behind palace walls, staff reported cold, clipped exchanges, if any at all. The press noticed, too. Without formal confirmation, the tabloids began speculating about Camilla's emotional health. Was she ill? Was she depressed? Headlines asked if this was the beginning of her quiet retirement, though none dared suggest that the queen consort had become, in essence, a ceremonial figure, no longer a player, but a pawn. The public, once sharply divided about her presence in the royal family, began to shift in tone. Some sympathized. Others pointed to it as the inevitable cost of a crown worn without ancestral claim. But inside the palace, the reality was far more personal. Camilla's children were out. Her influence was gone. And now, The only thing she had left was the silence of rooms that once echoed with possibility. The weight of Charles's decision hung in the air like a verdict that could not be appealed. But Camilla still clung to one quiet hope, that with time, her husband would reverse course. Once the public fury subsided, and the headlines grew quiet, Charles would find a way to quietly restore what had been taken, perhaps not in name, but in function. A meeting here. A symbolic gesture there. It didn't need to be public, it just needed to be real. For Camilla, redemption wasn't about power, it was about dignity. Yet even amid her solitude, Camilla still harbored one last hope, a belief that Charles would reverse course. But then came the final, devastating confirmation. Weeks later, a sealed royal document was quietly added to the Windsor archives. Its meaning, Camilla's family would never again be tied to the crown, and that decision was final. It was the last move in a long, painful game of royal chess. King Charles, after weeks of internal debate and external pressure, put pen to paper and signed an amendment that would permanently redefine the monarchy's inner circle. The updated trust protocols were precise, airtight, and generational in scope. From that moment forward, all roles tied to royal estate management, ceremonial financial oversight, and institutional influence would be reserved exclusively for direct bloodline heirs. At the center of it all stood two names, William and Charlotte. The future was being handed to them with no room left for question, compromise, or confusion. For Charles, the act was as agonizing as it was necessary. Along with the decree, he sent a handwritten note to Camilla. No staff, no royal seal, just his words. In it, he acknowledged the heartbreak, the cost, and his personal failure to protect the delicate line between love and legacy. He confessed that what began as inclusion had slowly mutated into intrusion not from malice, but from misjudgment. He ended the letter with 7 chilling words. "I had no choice. History demanded this." Princess Anne, whose restraint had broken only when duty demanded it, became the unexpected heroine in this unfolding chapter. Historians and commentators began praising her intervention as the pivotal moment that saved the crown from a slow internal collapse. Her defense of tradition, her unswerving loyalty to Queen Elizabeth's values, was now seen as the firewall that prevented the monarchy from being diluted beyond recognition. As the monarchy moved forward, Camilla moved back. Far back. She quietly withdrew from most public appearances, citing health and personal reflection. Sources close to the family say she relocated to the countryside, where she now spends most days away from palace life. Her voice, once influential in decisions that shaped royal affairs, was now absent. And although she still held the title of Queen Consort, it existed more in name than in spirit. Meanwhile, William rose. With the weight of clarity and public favor behind him, he stepped into an expanded royal role. His appearances multiplied, his speeches sharpened. His proximity to Charles grew tighter. And with Charlotte increasingly seen at his side during official events, the public began to glimpse a monarchy reshaped not through conflict, but through bloodline precision. Approval ratings soared. Newspapers ran headlines declaring a new era. The people felt heard, and for once, the institution felt aligned with their voice. Camilla's family faded into private life, their chapter in royal history now sealed and set aside. There would be no comebacks, no reversals. The silence from Buckingham was not temporary, it was final. And so, with one irreversible move, the monarchy reclaimed its bloodline, and Camilla's dream of dynastic legacy was erased by the very man she once stood beside as queen. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.